Hello everyone, welcome to the Lightning Ball channel. If you hadn't yet subscribed to my channel, please do so and activate the notification bell. Your support fuels my continued efforts. In our previous episode, Everudge had shocked everyone by transforming into Lucia, while Star King Dragon Veldanava silently observed the battlefield from afar. Meanwhile, on the battlefield where Guy faced Velzard in her stampede state, the primordial demons had unexpectedly reached a consensus to wait for Rimuru's arrival. And with Rimuru finally appearing, the battle entered a new phase. In this episode, we would witness Guy's computationally specialized form, his feminine form, and also see Guy's evaluation of Diablo's combat power, as well as his thoughts on that unbelievable slime. So let's get started. The moment Rimuru arrived at the battlefield, he was met with suffocating tension. Velzard, having taken on her strongest dragon form after being struck by Carrera's judgment bullet, was unleashing indiscriminate rampaging attacks. To protect the allies who had not yet fully evacuated, both Testarossa and Guy were using void energy, nihilistic world, to cancel out Velzard's destructive offensives. It should have been a breathtaking sight. Pearl-white dragon scales, absolute devastation, but Guy had no mood to appreciate any of it. Upon seeing Rimuru appear, Guy's first reaction was not relief but anger. He yelled at Rimuru, berating him for not coming to help sooner. Rimuru, however, was inwardly filled with grievances. He had been inexplicably teleported by Feldway to fucking nowhere, barely made it back, saved Milim immediately upon returning, watched over Diablo and Feldway's battle, and now he was being scolded by Guy. But being the intelligent slime he was, Rimuru chose to submit. Staring at the bristling Guy, he wisely held his tongue and switched straight into work mode. Rimuru ignored Diablo, who was currently engaged in a glare-off with Guy, typical Diablo behavior, and expanded his senses across the entire battlefield to perform a quick damage assessment. The situation was better than expected thanks to a few key individuals. First was the defense team. Moss and Misery were maintaining the outermost barrier, and together with Geld's defenses, they successfully neutralized any stray attacks that slipped past Testarossa and the others. Rimuru held Moss in especially high regard. This tiny demon really was impressively competent. Next was the MVP of the battlefield, Gabiru. Rimuru confirmed the reason everyone had thought out. It was Gabiru who activated the power of his once-a-day ultimate gift, Lord of Psychology, Destiny Alteration, to reverse the flow of battle. However, during his assessment, Rimuru noticed that Gabiru was indeed supplying energy to Sufia, but the posture and atmosphere between the two looked unmistakably like a pair of lovebirds flirting in the middle of a battlefield. Rimuru silently swore that once the war ended, he would definitely interrogate these two for daring to flirt in such a serious situation. Besides the couple, Rimuru also noticed Obera and Esprit. Obera, though suffering severe mana exhaustion, remained vigilant, showing absolute loyalty to Milim. Esprit, despite looking like a frivolous gal-type demon, was diligently assisting in defense. Overall, this sequence was Rimuru's battlefield catch-up. A simple but comprehensive recap. After confirming everyone's safety, Rimuru quickly made a tactical decision. The current problem was this. His allies had become liabilities. Powerhouses like Carrion and Frey, who were top tier on a normal battlefield, were fragile in front of a rampaging true dragon. Guy and Testarossa were forced to hold back to protect them. Thus, Rimuru decided to take the most straightforward approach. He would take over all battlefield defense himself. Rimuru released his dragon spirit, Haki. This was not ordinary pressure, but an absolute domain capable of covering the entire Eurazania battlefield. His aura suppressed Velzard's aura, and even overshadowed the void released by Guy and Testarossa. This overwhelming force shocked Guy immensely. Feeling this reckless surge of power, Guy angrily reached out to grab Rimuru by the collar and demand an explanation. Rimuru's response was textbook cowardice. He instantly dropped his human form, returned to his slime body, slipped right through Guy's fingers, and fell straight downward like a little blob. Of course, he didn't hit the ground. Diablo, who had long been waiting, caught him gently. just like Cheyenne or Shuna would, wearing a deeply satisfied expression. Guy and Diablo immediately started arguing over Rimuru. Taking advantage of their squabble, Rimuru tried to quietly slip away, only to be immediately scooped up into Testarosa's gentle embrace. Feeling her warmth and fragrance, Rimuru enjoyed it for a split second, but quickly reminded himself that he was not like Gabiru, who dared to flirt openly on a battlefield. He was a mature and composed man who understood situational awareness. With this sudden burst of self-discipline, he forced himself back into work mode. His first action was to replace his Dragon Spirit Haki with Imaginary Collapse, taking over the Void defense from both Testarossa and Guy. Once he would nullify Velzard's attacks, the rest of the battle would be firmly under his control. Testarossa wore an entranced expression, her admiration for Rimuru rising to an even higher level. Guy also stopped arguing with Diablo and stared in disbelief. He could not fathom how Rimuru had so effortlessly suppressed Velzard in her stampede state. Even Rimuru himself was surprised by his own power. This was not only thanks to Seal's divine-level assistance. More importantly, Rimuru's Magiculi reserves had grown to an outrageous scale. In truth, Rimuru felt he could solve the entire situation through brute force alone, but he also wanted to show Guy respect. His principle was simple: good enough is enough. So he deliberately asked Guy about the next step of the plan. Guy was clearly on the verge of breaking down. His frustration boiled over, and he started settling accounts, insisting that Velzard becoming like this was all the fault of Rimuru's subordinate, the reckless Carrera. Rimuru pretended not to understand, but calmly replied that he believed Carrera had made the correct decision. Carrera immediately leaned in eagerly, her expression filled with expectation, clearly hoping to be praised. Rimuru hesitated for a moment, debating whether he should pat her on the head, but since he was still in slime form, he opted for a simple verbal compliment. Even that alone made Carrera incredibly happy. But then Rain also came over, looking like she wanted to be praised as well. Rimuru felt Rain hadn't actually contributed much, and she was clearly Guy's subordinate, so praising her felt inappropriate. So Rimuru switched to polite conversation instead, asking whether her preparations had gone smoothly. Rain answered using past tense, saying everything had already been completed. She then explained that she had only been dragged into this brutal battlefield because she could not disobey Gi-sama's orders. Between the lines, she subtly implied that delaying Rimuru-sama's previous request had been unavoidable. Rimuru and Rain then whispered to each other about how unreasonable Guy was, only for Guy to catch them in the act. He accused Rimuru of constantly inciting Rain lately, saying Rain now listened to Rimuru's orders more than to his own. Rimuru was also puzzled by Rain's attitude. Testarossa bluntly pointed out that, as Guy's subordinate, Rain should not be getting too close to Rimuru-sama. Rain was shocked, staring at Testarossa with wide eyes and calling her Oni-sama in disbelief. This title was actually the result of Rain losing a bet earlier when her defensive barrier was shattered. But Testarossa clearly disliked the nickname, finding Rain's shamelessness unbefitting of a primordial demon. Diablo also took this chance to act superior to Rain, agreeing with Testarossa and telling Rain she should recognize her place. Diablo generally acted condescending toward anyone who wasn't Rimuru-sama, but since getting caught last time for secretly hoarding Rimuru-sama's portrait, he had unexpectedly toned down quite a bit toward Rain, and seemed to show more respect toward Testarossa as well. Even so, he still looked ready to snatch Rimuru-sama out of Testarosa's arms at any moment. In any case, Rimuru finally understood the situation and genuinely admired Carrera's quick, decisive judgment. If it had been him, he would never have casually used a once-per-day trump card so easily. And although Guy complained, it was clear he inwardly agreed with Carrera's decision. Eventually, after much back-and-forth bickering, the strategy was set. Rimuru would suppress Velzard. Guy would enter Velzard's consciousness to awaken her. Diablo would protect Guy's defenseless physical body during the process. And since Velzard was the only remaining threat here, Rimuru ordered everyone, except Diablo, to follow Testarossa and immediately teleport to the Heaven Tower to reinforce the fight against Ivaraj. Testarossa had already predicted Rimuru-sama's plan, and Moss had been spreading the commands throughout the battlefield. Although Testarossa and Carrera both wanted to stay by Rimuru-sama's side, they could not disobey orders. Despite a hint of disappointment, both showed fierce fighting spirit. When Diablo heard Rimuru would keep only him here, he practically ascended to heaven on the spot. He proudly bragged to Testarossa and Carrera that Rimuru-sama clearly trusted him most. The three immediately started glaring at each other again. Rimuru was completely speechless. The truth was, he had let Diablo stay because Diablo had exhausted himself in the fight against Feldway. Rimuru simply wanted him to stay in a relatively safer place and rest. But seeing Testarossa's displeasure and Carrera itching for a fight, Rimuru had no choice but to shout at Diablo to shut up. Rain quietly asked whether she should stay as well, only for Guy to yell at her to go fight. Terrified, Rain immediately ran off with the others. Back on the battlefield, although Rimuru used imaginary collapse to perfectly suppress Velzard's attacks and ensure 0 casualties, he knew this was only a temporary measure. Rimuru understood that a decisive battle was occurring on the other side of the world in Damargania. If they didn't settle things here quickly, the consequences would be catastrophic. Diablo saw Rimuru-sama's concern and asked Guy how long it would take to restore Velzard-sama's sanity. Guy answered a while, which made Rimuru's heart tighten. A while could mean days, or even a week. By then, the world would already be destroyed, and Rimuru still wasn't sure whether Velzard would be friend or foe after regaining her senses. He still didn't understand why Velzard had cooperated with Feldway in the first place. The only reasonable explanation he had was that she had been having a marital dispute with Guy. Guy angrily yelled at Rimuru, but then revealed an unexpected option. He said he would use his computationally specialized form, which should shorten the process. 1 day at most. A computationally specialized form meant sacrificing close combat ability in exchange for massively enhanced processing power. Considering overall combat capability, this did not make him weaker. Demons were fundamentally spiritual life forms, a race inherently adept at magic. Close-range monsters like Guy or Diablo were the exceptions. Of course, for Guy, who pursued absolute power, this extreme form was something he would only use in special circumstances. As soon as he finished speaking, Guy's form underwent a dramatic transformation. The once domineering red-haired demon lord instantly shifted into a breathtakingly beautiful, red-haired woman. Rimuru was stunned, unable to stop himself from muttering that apparently demons really could switch genders. But that single sentence triggered Diablo's bizarre sense of competition. He immediately declared that if Rimuru-sama wished, he too could transform. Before Diablo could finish that extremely dangerous statement, Rimuru hurriedly cut him off and told him to shut up and focus on the battle. Returning to Guy's computationally specialized form, this was not a simple gender swap, but an extreme tactical adjustment. This form essentially sacrificed all physical ability, allocating every possible skill point into magical computation. As a woman, Guy's physical defense plummeted, and his body became fragile to an absurd degree. Although layers of multi-barriers could compensate to some extent, entering a battlefield of this level with an immobile and vulnerable body was practically suicide. If he did not trust Rimuru completely, and Diablo, this tactic would have been unthinkable. Of course, logically, leaving Testarossa and Carrera behind to guard him would have been safer, but Guy's pride would never permit such a safe choice. Since even Rimuru had judged that Diablo alone was sufficient, if Guy still worried about his own protection, it would be admitting he was weaker in spirit than that slime. For Guy, that humiliation was worse than death, and at the very worst, he would simply lose his bet and die. For a primordial demon, death only meant a revival at most, a few centuries later. In their long, eternal lives, even dying once to alleviate boredom wasn't much of a downside. Another reason Guy dared to gamble was that he had finally seen through Diablo's true strength. With the computationally specialized form granting extreme analytical clarity, Guy conducted a precise combat assessment of the current Diablo. In Guy's memory, the original Diablo had always been an anomaly, a warrior with top-tier battle instinct who pursued technique rather than raw power. Under equal conditions, Diablo had never once lost, and that was what made him terrifying. Now, the limitation of equal conditions no longer seemed relevant. Guy was shocked to find that Diablo not only retained his unmatched technique, but his existence points had skyrocketed, to the point where he was almost catching up to Guy himself. Even more alarming was the faint trace of void energy clinging to Diablo's aura. Guy deduced that since Rimuru had gone to take care of Milim, the one who must have repelled Feldway was Diablo, which meant that now Diablo was no longer bound to equal conditions. He had grown into an absolute powerhouse on the same tier as Guy. Even though Diablo's body looked as if it might collapse at any moment, Guy judged that he was still more than capable of handling the vast majority of Apex-tier enemies. Rimuru's decision had been correct and entirely reasonable. But more than Diablo's growth, what truly left Guy unable to comprehend was Rimuru. Even in his hyper-analytical form, capable of parsing all things, Guy still could not see through Rimuru's essence. That slime was a massive, impossible riddle. Guy muttered inwardly, wondering what on earth Rimuru actually was. Of course, he knew that even if he asked, Rimuru would brush him off with the same old line. He was just an ordinary slime. Guy decided that once everything was over, he would interrogate that slime properly. And in the very moment he was thinking that, the sight before his eyes confirmed his confusion. Rimuru released his human form. His massive slime body swelled rapidly, not to clash violently with Velzard, but to wrap around her like a gigantic cushion of jelly. It looked as if he were tenderly cradling a baby. The same void energy that even Testarossa had to wield with extreme care, struggling to maintain, was controlled effortlessly by Rimuru, as if it were nothing more than soft cloth for a blanket. Watching that slime gently swaddle the cataclysm-level frost dragon, Velzard, Guy felt the sight was both incomprehensible and absurdly comical. What even Guy deemed impossible, Rimuru accomplished with ease. It was proof that Rimuru's abnormality as an existence had reached a level beyond absurd, but there was no time to dwell on it. Guy focused every part of his awareness on Velzard. He separated from his physical body, returning to the demon race's original spiritual form. In this state, his appearance shifted back to his male form. With practiced ease, he slipped through Velzard's layered mental defenses, quietly descending toward the abyss where the essence of a true dragon's soul resided. The true danger lay ahead. Once he touched Velzard's core, Guy shed even his spiritual form, becoming a completely defenseless astral body. A single misstep meant being swallowed whole by Velzard's spirit. His technique, the aggressive core erosion spiritual dive, would collapse instantly, and Guy's consciousness would vanish forever. But Guy felt no fear. He did not need to force anything. He only needed to proceed gently, cautiously, as though soothing Velzard's rampaging heart, and sink in slowly. Brute force was absolutely forbidden. That would only destroy Velzard's core and cause her to release all her energy and perish outright. And even if true dragons were immortal and could revive with the same soul, would a reborn Velzard with altered memories and personality still be the same Velzard? Guy once told Rimuru that possessing the same soul meant being the same person. But now, even he began to doubt those words. Despite his urgency, Guy did not grow impatient. Methodically breaking through the final layer of defense, he finally saw Velzard's spiritual form, sitting curled up, hugging her knees, like a lost and frightened child. All right, that's all for this video. This episode was largely a transitional episode, one that could honestly be summarized in a single minute. But since many of you have already finished the final volume of TenSura, I think no one is in a rush. We can take our time. At this pace, covering the entire novel will probably take more than 20 episodes. Compressing it into a dozen seems unrealistic. One thing I'm genuinely happy about is that, finally, in this last volume, the author stopped vaguely hinting at Rimuru's uniqueness. Instead, he openly and repeatedly emphasized Rimuru's special nature, and it felt incredibly satisfying to read. In our next episode, we will briefly cover how Guy awakened Velzard, but the focus would shift to Velzard's perspective, including Veldanava's revival, and how Velzard underwent a skill integration evolution identical to Velgrind and Veldora's, all thanks to Seal. The next episode will be just as exciting. If you enjoyed this video, please like, comment, and subscribe. Your support is greatly appreciated. See you in the next one.